It was supposed to be an ordinary day for Agent Marcus Davis, one of the few black agents serving in the FBI's elite field office in Washington, D.C. As he stepped out of his car and adjusted his tie, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He had worked tirelessly to get here, a position that wasn't just a title, but a symbol of perseverance, sacrifice, and dedication. The road had been far from easy, filled with countless obstacles, subtle prejudices, and outright challenges. But Marcus never let it slow him down. Today, however, he would face something that even his years of training and experience couldn't have prepared him for. As he approached the building's front entrance, Marcus noticed a white officer stationed at the door. It wasn't unusual. Security officers were posted at nearly every federal building in the city. But something about the officer's stance caught his attention. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a rigid posture and an intense gaze, seemed to lock eyes with Marcus the moment he was within view. Marcus offered a polite nod as he reached for his badge, a gesture he performed countless times before. But this time, it didn't go as expected. "Hold up," the officer barked, stepping forward and blocking the doorway with his arm. His voice carried a sharp edge, loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by. Marcus froze for a moment, confused by the man's tone. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked calmly, holding up his badge so the officer could see it clearly. The gold shield glinted in the sunlight, unmistakable in its authenticity, but the officer didn't budge. "Step back," the officer ordered, his voice more forceful now. Marcus frowned, glancing at the badge in his hand and then back at the officer. "I'm Agent Marcus Davis," he said evenly. "This is my office. I'm here to work." The officer's expression hardened. "I said step back," he repeated, this time gripping his belt where his radio and other equipment were holstered. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, dripping with suspicion and an authority that felt misplaced. Marcus could feel the tension in the air now, thick and undeniable. He'd been in high-pressure situations before, stakeouts, raids, interrogations. But this was different. This wasn't about protocol or procedure, it was personal. He could sense it in the officer's demeanor, in the way his eyes scrutinized him like he didn't belong. "I don't think you understand," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "I'm a federal agent. You're obstructing me from entering a federal building." The officer let out a scoff, glancing around as if looking for backup. "I've heard that one before," he muttered under his breath, his hand now hovering near the radio. Marcus took a slow breath, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't let this escalate. There were rules, protocols, and above all, his own integrity. But how far could he push back without compromising himself or the badge he worked so hard to earn? And why was this happening here, in a place where justice was supposed to be blind? A small crowd had begun to gather nearby, their murmurs barely audible over the pounding in Marcus's ears. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The officer seemed to notice too, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before he quickly masked it with another glare. Marcus's mind was already spinning with options. Should he call his supervisor? Should he stand his ground and refuse to move? Or should he comply, knowing full well that doing so would mean letting this officer's prejudice win, if only for a moment? Before Marcus could decide, something unexpected happened, something that would change the course of this confrontation in an instant and leave everyone, including the officer, questioning everything they thought they knew. Let me know if you'd like to explore the next part. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his pulse quickening. The officer's hand hovered near his radio, and for a split second, Marcus considered the possibilities. If this escalated, what would happen? Would the situation spiral out of control in front of the growing crowd? Would he, a federal agent who had sworn to uphold the law, be forced to defend himself against an unjust accusation on the very steps of the FBI office? But before Marcus could take his next breath, a voice rang out from behind them, breaking the tense silence. "What's going on here?" The day unfolded in a blur of meetings, briefings, and paperwork, but Marcus couldn't shake the tension lingering in the back of his mind. He noticed the way a few colleagues glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. Had they heard about the incident at the entrance? Were they judging him or simply unsure of what to say? By the time he left the office that evening, Marcus felt drained. As he walked back to his car, the memory of the officer's words replayed in his head. He didn't look like he belonged. The phrase echoed like a challenge, daring him to confront it head-on. He sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as he considered his next move. He knew he couldn't let the incident go unaddressed, not just for himself, but for the other agents and officers who might face similar treatment in the future. But how could he bring it up without risking his own career or alienating his colleagues? As Marcus drove home, his mind swirled with questions and doubts. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let this slide. He had worked too hard and come too far to let someone else's prejudice dictate his worth. What Marcus didn't know was that the incident at the entrance was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, forces were at play that would soon thrust him into the middle of a much larger conflict, one that would test his resolve, his integrity, and everything he believed in. The day unfolded in a blur of meetings, briefings, and paperwork, but Marcus couldn't shake the tension lingering in the back of his mind. He noticed the way a few colleagues glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. Had they heard about the incident at the entrance? Were they judging him, or simply unsure of what to say? By the time he left the office that evening, Marcus felt drained. As he walked back to his car, the memory of the officer's words replayed in his head. He didn't look like he belonged. The phrase echoed like a challenge, daring him to confront it head-on. He sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as he considered his next move. He knew he couldn't let the incident go unaddressed, not just for himself, but for the other agents and officers who might face similar treatment in the future. But how could he bring it up without risking his own career or alienating his colleagues? As Marcus drove home, his mind swirled with questions and doubts. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let this slide. He had worked too hard and come too far to let someone else's prejudice dictate his worth. What Marcus didn't know was that the incident at the entrance was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, forces were at play that would soon thrust him into the middle of a much larger conflict, one that would test his resolve, his integrity, and everything he believed in. He hit send, hoping the conversation would help him sort through his thoughts. But as he set the phone down, a nagging feeling crept into his chest. This was bigger than just one incident. He could feel it, like a storm brewing on the horizon. What he didn't realize was that the storm was closer than he thought, and it was about to change everything. The next few days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Marcus couldn't shake the memory of the officer's words. Asterisk, he didn't look like he belonged. Asterisk, it was a subtle insult, but it stung deep, and it kept him awake at night. As he sat at his desk in the FBI's field office, surrounded by paperwork and cases to review, his mind wandered. What was the real issue here? Was it just a rogue officer, or was there something deeper at play? Marcus knew the Bureau wasn't immune to the systemic issues that plagued law enforcement across the country. He had seen it before, in the undercurrents of jokes that didn't sit right, in the way some of his colleagues acted around him. It was always there, just beneath the surface, but he had pushed it aside, focusing on the work. Yet now, it seemed impossible to ignore. The incident with the officer was a wake-up call, one that he couldn't push aside. He tried to distract himself, diving into a high-profile case that was on his plate. A string of robberies had been plaguing D.C., and the FBI had been tasked with finding the criminals behind them. Marcus was part of the team investigating the case, and as much as he wanted to throw himself into it to escape his thoughts, he couldn't help but feel like something was missing, like there was something bigger going on that he wasn't seeing. That afternoon, as Marcus reviewed the surveillance footage from a recent robbery, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from his mentor, Agent Calvin Hayes. Calvin had been a guide for Marcus throughout his career, someone who always seemed to have the right words at the right time. Marcus hesitated for a moment before opening the message. Asterisk, we need to talk. Meet me after work. I know what's been bothering you. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. Was this about the officer? Was Calvin finally going to talk about the things Marcus had been avoiding? He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it either. He left the office as soon as the day ended, making his way to a small, quiet bar on the outskirts of the city where he and Calvin often met. The place was dimly lit, a low hum of conversation in the background. Calvin was already seated at a corner booth when Marcus arrived, his large frame slouched against the leather seat, nursing a beer. Calvin had a way of always looking calm, as if nothing could rattle him. Marcus invited that. I know why you called me here, Marcus said, sliding into the booth across from Calvin. I can't stop thinking about what happened with that officer. Calvin didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a long sip of his beer, eyeing Marcus over the rim of the glass. The silence hung between them, heavy and thick, before Calvin spoke in his usual measured tone. I know it's been bothering you, but it's more than just one officer. You've been around long enough to know that. Marcus leaned back in his seat, frustration bubbling up inside him. I know it. I've seen the way things work around here. But what do I do about it? Do I just keep my head down and keep pushing through? That's what I've always done, but I don't know anymore. Calvin set his glass down and looked at Marcus with a hard stare. You can't ignore it anymore. You're not just one of the few black agents here, Marcus. You're an example. The system is broken, and people like you are constantly stuck in the middle of it. You're caught between doing your job and dealing with people who want to tear you down just because of the color of your skin. It's not fair. Marcus felt the weight of Calvin's words. He had known all of this on some level, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way that it hadn't been before. But what do I do about it? I'm not a politician. I'm not in charge of the bureau. All I can do is my job and keep my head down. Calvin shook his head. It's not about keeping your head down. It's about speaking up. About doing something that forces change, and you're in a position to do that. I know it's hard, but you can't let this slide. I've seen the way you work. You're too good to let this pass. Marcus looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of the conversation. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to remain calm and collected in the face of adversity. But now, with the world around him feeling like it was crumbling, he wasn't so sure anymore. The tension was unbearable, and the anger simmering just below the surface threatened to boil over. Have you ever had to deal with something like this, Calvin? Marcus asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Calvin took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. For a moment, it seemed like he was lost in his thoughts. Yeah, I've had my fair share, but it's different for me. I'm a white agent. I don't carry the same weight you do, the same burden, but I've seen it happen to you, Marcus. I've seen the looks, the comments. I've seen people treat you like you're not supposed to be here, and it kills me. Marcus nodded slowly. He had known Calvin cared, but hearing him say it aloud made it feel real. It was like the validation he had been searching for, but he still didn't know how to move forward. What should I do then? Marcus asked, his voice cracking slightly. Should I report it? Should I confront the officer? I don't even know where to start. Calvin leaned forward, his expression hardening. You have to stand up for yourself, and for others. It's not just about you, Marcus. It's about everyone who's ever been in your shoes. If you don't speak out, then nothing will ever change. You've got the chance to make a difference. Don't waste it. Marcus sat back, taking in the gravity of what Calvin was saying. His mentor was right. The weight of the world seemed to be on his shoulders, but he couldn't let fear or uncertainty hold him back. He had a choice. He could either stay silent, or he could speak out and try to bring about real change. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the office early. The building was quiet, but he felt the tension in the air. He knew that the moment he stepped into his office, he'd have to decide what to do next. But as he made his way down the hallway, something else caught his attention, a whisper of movement, a conversation taking place behind closed doors. He paused, straining to hear. "I told you, he's not the right one for the job," a voice murmured. "We need someone who understands how to keep things under control." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Asterisk who, were they talking about asterisk? Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. His pulse quickened, his senses sharpened as the voices behind the door grew louder. He recognized the first one, Officer Davis, the one who had blocked him from entering the building just days ago. But the second voice was unfamiliar, low, and calculated. Whoever they were, they clearly didn't want Marcus to hear their conversation. He stood frozen, barely breathing, hoping the voices wouldn't notice his presence. The words cut through the silence, each one like a dagger aimed directly at him. "We can't afford to have him here any longer," Officer Davis's voice echoed. "He's a liability. I've heard the rumors. He's not one of us. Too much trouble." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. He pressed himself against the wall, his mind racing. What was this about? Were they talking about him? It felt too specific to be a coincidence, but what did they mean by liability? What rumors? He couldn't afford to let his curiosity get the better of him, but he couldn't just walk away either. Not when this could be about his career, and perhaps even more. The second voice, calm and composed, responded with a tone that sent a shiver through him. "We'll handle it. There's a way to push him out without making a scene. He's been too focused on his own agenda anyway. We don't need that kind of attention right now." The blood drained from Marcus's face. His mind raced as he tried to piece the conversation together. Asterisk agenda. What kind of agenda asterisk? Before he could process everything, the door swung open, and Marcus stepped back just in time to avoid being seen. He didn't know what to do, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to confront them, to demand answers. The last thing he wanted was to walk into a trap. He backed up slowly, careful not to make a sound, until he was far enough down the hallway to retreat to the nearby stairwell. His heart was hammering in his chest, and he was fighting to keep his breathing steady. Every step he took felt like it was pulling him deeper into a game he didn't fully understand. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that something was wrong. The officer's words weren't just about him being an agent, they were about something bigger. A coordinated effort to remove him from the Bureau, from the FBI. How far did this go? Marcus had always believed in the system. He had spent years defending it, working tirelessly to uphold justice. But now it felt like he was being pushed out of it from the inside. And worse, he didn't even know who he could trust. He made his way to his desk, his mind swirling with possibilities. His phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from Calvin, it was an email. Marcus opened it without thinking, his eyes scanning the text quickly. The message was short, cryptic, and signed off by an anonymous name. Asterisk, watch your back. They're after you. They won't stop until you're gone. Asterisk. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he reread the message, the weight of its words sinking in. His heart pounded in his chest, a dangerous combination of adrenaline and fear flooding his veins. Who was this? How did they know? And why now? He glanced around the office, his mind working overtime to put together the puzzle. There was no way he could confront the officers head-on. He needed to gather evidence. He needed to get to the bottom of this before anyone knew what he was up to. But as Marcus gathered his things, preparing to leave the office early to think things through, he was intercepted. Anne Reynolds appeared at the door, her expression unreadable as she stepped into his office. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady, "we need to talk." He froze, the air between them thick with tension. Anne had always seemed like someone he could trust, but after what he'd just overheard, he wasn't so sure anymore. Was she part of whatever was going on? Or was she simply trying to help? He didn't know who to trust anymore, not even those closest to him. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What's this about?" Anne stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the click of it latching seeming impossibly loud in the quiet room. "I've been hearing things, Marcus, things that concern me." She paused, glancing at the door before lowering her voice. "People are talking. There are forces within the Bureau that don't want you here. They're starting to question your place here, your loyalty. They think you're causing too much attention, stirring up too much trouble." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach, and a cold wave of realization swept over him. She knew. She had to know. But why was she telling him now? Why hadn't she said anything earlier? "You're not the first to be targeted like this," Anne continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen it happen before. Good agents, loyal agents. All of a sudden, they're pushed out or, worse." She looked him. Marcus could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him as he stood in the parking garage, staring into the empty space where Anne and Officer Davis had just disappeared. His heart was pounding, the betrayal burning deep in his chest. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. The person he had trusted the most, was part of this scheme. This faction working to dismantle everything he had believed in. His mind spun in 1,000 directions. He needed answers, but more importantly, he needed to put an end to this, once and for all. He glanced at Calvin, who was still watching the garage entrance with a tense expression. "What now?" Marcus whispered, the words laced with both fear and determination. "We can't let this go on any longer." Calvin turned to him, his face grim but resolute. "We need to confront them. All of them. We've got the proof, but it's not enough to just catch them in the act. We need something that'll bring it all down, something irrefutable. Tonight's our chance." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. There was no turning back now. They had to act before they were silenced. Together, they made their way toward the exit of the parking garage, knowing that the next few hours would either make or break everything they had worked for. They headed to a safe house, a location Calvin had set up years ago for moments just like this. A place where they could regroup, plan, and gather their evidence. Marcus's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to piece together what had happened over the last few days. What was Anne's true role in all of this? Was she simply a pawn, or had she been manipulating him from the start? Once inside, they got to work. Calvin had a secure connection to the Bureau's internal systems, and Marcus watched in stunned silence as Calvin pulled up files, confidential documents, private emails, and audio recordings, everything they would need to expose the corruption. The deeper they dug, the darker the picture became. Officer Davis wasn't just a low-level officer. He was a key player in a much larger operation. And Annie? She was more than just a bystander. She had been actively feeding information, playing the role of the double agent within the Bureau itself. "What do you think they're really after?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he scanned the files. "What could they possibly want with all this power?" Calvin didn't answer right away, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he uncovered more details. Finally, he stopped and looked up. "It's not just power, it's control. They're trying to reshape the Bureau, take it back to a time before all these reforms, before accountability, before diversity, before anyone questioned their authority. They want to protect their own agenda, even if it means destroying everything the Bureau stands for." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. Everything he had fought for, the ideals he believed in, had been a lie. They were trying to corrupt the very institution he had sworn to protect. The stakes had never been higher. The system was broken, and they were the only ones who could fix it. Calvin turned to him, his face hardening. "We're going to expose them. We have everything we need. The only question is, who do we trust with this?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "We go public. We take this to the press, to the people. The truth needs to be known." Just as they were about to finalize their plan, a loud bang echoed through the room. Marcus spun around, his heart racing. The door burst open, and in stepped Anne, her expression fierce and determined. She wasn't alone. Officer Davis stood beside her, a smug grin plastered across his face. I should have known you wouldn't back down, Marcus, Anne said, her voice colder than he had ever heard it. But you're too naive if you think you can stop us now. Marcus's blood ran cold. It was a trap. They had been setting him up all along, and now it was too late. Officer Davis stepped forward, pulling out a weapon and aiming it directly at Marcus. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. They had been monitoring him the entire time. Every move he made had been calculated, and now they were about to silence him for good. But just as things seemed darkest, a third figure stepped into the room. It was someone Marcus hadn't expected, Calvin. Only this wasn't the Calvin he knew. This was a different version, colder, more dangerous. You should have listened to me, Marcus, the second Calvin said, his voice full of venom. You've been a pawn in this game from the start. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. What? No, this isn't possible. Calvin, you can't be part of this. The second Calvin laughed, stepping closer. I'm sorry, Marcus. You were never meant to be part of this new world. You're just a stepping stone. Everything clicked into place. The messages, the strange behavior, it had all been a setup. The real betrayal wasn't just Anne. It was Calvin. The man who had mentored him, guided him through the bureau, had been manipulating him from the very beginning. As the pieces fell into place, Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just about the FBI. This was about something much bigger, something deeper. He had been caught in the crossfire of a war for control, and he had no idea how deep the corruption ran. Before he could act, Officer Davis lunged forward, but Marcus was faster. He grabbed a nearby chair and swung it, knocking the weapon out of Davis's hands. Anne made a move toward him, but he dodged, knocking her into the wall with a swift shove. It was chaos, absolute chaos. The room was filled with shouting, the sound of scrambling feet, but through it all, Marcus kept his focus. He had to escape. He had to make sure the truth came out. Just as he reached for his phone to call for help, Calvin, his true mentor, stepped forward, grabbing Marcus by the arm and pulling him into a corner. Get out of here. They'll kill you if they catch you now. But as Marcus looked into Calvin's eyes, something shifted. The cold, calculating look in the other man's eyes was gone. Instead, there was something else, regret. I never wanted this, Calvin said quietly, his voice breaking. But now it's too late for both of us. With a final look, Calvin pushed Marcus toward the door, giving him a single chance to escape. Marcus didn't hesitate, he ran. As he burst out into the night, the weight of everything hit him all at once. The world he had known, the FBI, his career, the people he trusted, had all been a lie. But there was one thing Marcus knew for certain: he wasn't done yet. The battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. And the truth was finally coming to light. But as he disappeared into the shadows, the final twist came. From the darkness behind him, a voice called out, "You think you've won, Marcus. The real war is just beginning." And with that, Marcus knew. The fight for everything he believed in had only just begun. Marcus's heart raced as he dashed through the alley, the cold night air stinging his skin. The echo of that final ominous voice still haunted him, its warning lingering like a shadow. The real war is just beginning. He didn't know whether it was a threat or a promise, but it was clear that his life was never going to be the same. Not after everything he had learned, and not after what he had witnessed in that small, dimly lit room. He stumbled through the streets, his mind racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened over the past few days. Anne, the woman he had trusted, betrayed him. Calvin, his mentor, the man who had guided him through the bureau, was nothing more than another piece of the puzzle in a much larger conspiracy. The corruption ran deep. It wasn't just about the FBI. It was about power, manipulation, and control. A network of people willing to destroy everything for their own benefit. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He couldn't be. Not after everything he had learned. He had to make sure that the truth came out. He had to fight back against the system that had tried to use him, that had tried to break him. Marcus knew what he had to do. He had to get out of the city. He needed time to think, to regroup. The bureau had eyes everywhere, and the last thing he needed was to be caught in the crossfire. But he couldn't stay away forever. The world needed to know what was happening inside the bureau. The public had to hear the truth. He would expose the corruption. He would bring the powerful people to justice. The first step was to contact trusted allies. There was one journalist, Lisa Torres, who had been working undercover within the bureau, trying to uncover corruption for months. Marcus had met her once during a covert investigation, and she had always struck him as someone who cared about justice. If anyone could help him get the truth to the public, it was her. He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed her number. His hands shook slightly as he waited for her to pick up. "Lisa," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's Marcus."